Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our weekly update on COVID-19. Today, the 23rd of February, and actually from today, there's been a bit of a change in terms of the vaccination schedule. It's had quite a lot of publicity, and I thought I'd devote quite a bit of today's discussion on why there has been this change and really to kind of give a bit of background to the change as well. So yeah, there has been quite a lot of publicity. I heard quite a lot of questions about the changes of schedule. Why has it come about? What does it mean? What does it allow us to do? The one thing I must mention is that these time intervals are really minimum time intervals. In other words, the interval, I'll come to just now, but the reduction from 6 weeks between the two Pfizer doses to 3 weeks. 3 weeks is the minimum. But you know, if you schedule to come on a particular day and you've got a hair appointment on that day, or you've got timeshare on that day, you can come a bit later. These are just the minimal times in the schedule. All right, just in terms of the epidemic, not a great deal to really talk about here. Let me get on to. We haven't really advanced very much for what I spoke about the last couple of weeks, in fact. If you look at the epidemic curve, it's still plateauing here. It hasn't, it's stubbornly refusing to go down to the level, we call it baseline level, of what it was between the other waves. So we still got this kind of flattening over here just about, but we are out, officially out of the fourth wave. I say officially, we set various criteria, for example, less than 5 cases per week, 5 cases per 100,000 per day, or less than 30 cases per 100,000 per week. And we have reached that stage. So we are out of the fourth wave, and we're just grumbling along in this phase over here. So look at the last 24 hours is the NICD website, NICD page. And we're really kind of averaging about 2,000 new cases per day at the moment. Fortunately, the mortality has gone very low at the moment. That's great news. And what's really keeping up this phase is that middle kind of plateauing is really the Gauteng province and to some extent the Western Cape. You can see this is really what's keeping it going further down to the interwave level. Here's the interprovincial breakdown. You see Gauteng and the Western Cape, some of the Northern Cape are the only provinces where there has been an increase in the 7-day moving average. Coming closer to home, the Jewish community in Johannesburg, looking at the Hatzola monitoring data, you can see, in fact, there's been quite a steady increase in new cases coming onto the home monitoring program. In fact, where we are at the moment, 124 new cases, it's about just under 4 times what it was a month ago. So the COVID epidemic or outbreak is still kind of grumbling on in the Jewish community. I think to a large extent we're having super spreading events, people having various functions, engagements and bar mitzvahs and weddings and so on. And with monotonous regularity, we have outbreaks. We have super spreading outbreaks following on these functions. So unfortunately, I would love to say we go back to normal. But at this stage, we can't take off our mask, and we still need to have physical distancing, and we still need to try and control these social functions, because otherwise we are still going to have these cases. At any rate, what I really want to talk mainly about is the issue about vaccination and trying to explain the scheduling and so on. So if we look at the daily administration of vaccines, it's been a slight improvement from about 50,000 a few weeks ago up to 77,000, but still way under what we really need to be. We need to be about 250 to 300,000 doses of vaccine administered daily if we're trying to get to even the global average. And I'll show you just now, we are quite below the global average. So this is what we look like overall. As you can see, adults who are vaccinated, 47.58%. In other words, adults who have received at least 1 dose of vaccine. Look at adults who are fully vaccinated, in other words, 2 doses of Pfizer or 1 dose of Johnson & Johnson, 42.45%. That's quite a bit lower than the global average. The global average is about 55% fully vaccinated, or 63% having at least one dose. Unfortunately, low-income countries, and these are predominantly, in fact, African countries, to the north was 12% at least one dose, so very, very low. This is very important because in these countries is where that virus is continually replicating and where we still have that threat of new variants coming about. But let me come back to our vaccination coverage. The adolescents, the 12 to 17-year-olds, and 21.24% have been vaccinated with at least one dose. And we really are still concerned with the high risk group, the older individuals. If we look at the 60 pluses, this looks quite good, 2/3, but look at those who've been fully vaccinated of the 60 plus year old age group, still fairly lowish, 61.5%. We really need to get this about 70 to 80% in that high risk group. And even the 50 to 59-year-old group, it's still pretty low, under 60%. And of course, the younger adults, it's quite low as well. If we look at the booster uptake, how many people have taken boosters? Well, first of all, the second J&J, the second J is regarded as a booster at this stage. The primary vaccination for Johnson & Johnson vaccine is one dose. So the second dose, people coming for the second dose at this stage is regarded as a booster. And only 498,000, or 6.7% of the individuals who had the first dose have come back for the second dose. So there's been a sharp drop off of people coming back for the second Johnson & Johnson. And similarly, people who've had two doses of Pfizer, only 433,000 doses have been given for the third dose. There was about 3.68% of people who had two Pfizers that come back for the third Pfizer. In regard to the second adolescent, better, 236,000, in other words, 15.6% of adolescents who had one dose of Pfizer, which is incomplete vaccination, have come back for the second dose. So we're looking at a vaccination situation which is a little bit concerning, which is a little bit worrying. In other words, we're having people, there's adequate stores of vaccine. In that respect, the government has been good. We do have enough vaccine, but we're not getting vaccine to people's arms. For some extent, I think it is maybe some degree of apathy. People now are not kind of driven to come back to get the vaccination, either to complete the vaccination schedule or to come back for boosters. To some extent, it may also be people are nervous of the vaccine hesitance. People haven't been vaccinated at all. To some people, unfortunately, it's difficult to get to a vaccination site. They might stay very far away from a vaccination site, or it's expensive to take off a day's work, the cost for transport, and also, unfortunately, then particularly in the more far-flung areas, it's not easy to kind of set up vaccination sites close to where people live. There are quite formidable logistical challenges to have numerous vaccine sites which are stocked with vaccines, which do have a very, very short lifespan. And in terms of Pfizer vaccine, which has to be stored at very low temperatures, again, there's a major logistical challenge. And then, of course, we also do have the anti-vaxxers. So the government does need to put a lot of effort now to increase vaccination coverage. And this was one of the reasons why the scheduling changes were looked at and have been revised. Now, just to kind of put it into perspective, there are two changes. The one change is the dosing interval, the interval between the primary two doses of Pfizer as well as the booster. And as I mentioned earlier, these times are minimal times that these are the minimal times. You can come later. If it's inconvenient to come on a particular day or whatever it is, please don't not come at all. If we say 3 weeks, if you come 4 weeks or 5 weeks or 6 weeks or 7 weeks, it's really not going to make that much difference. So that's the one, the dosing intervals. And the second is what's often referred to as mix and match. In other words, up to now, we've been having what we call homologous vaccination. If you get to one Pfizer in your primary, you'll come back for a second Pfizer, the same vaccine, and you'll come back for a booster Pfizer. That's what we call homologous vaccines or homologous vaccination, the same vaccine. Heterologous means you start off with one vaccine, say Pfizer, and you come for your second vaccine, which can be another one, Johnson & Johnson, or the other way around. Start with Johnson and you come back for a Pfizer. Why this has arisen is that there have been several studies overseas where they've shown that if there's a heterologous vaccine, in other words, a mixing of the vaccines. Now, you must remember these vaccines are produced in different ways. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is what we call an adenovirus vector. We use an adenovirus as a kind of a vehicle to introduce the gene, which is going to make the protein against which you're going to develop immunity. In the case of the Pfizer vaccine, it's what you call an RNA vaccine. In other words, the nucleic acid, the gene itself, encased in a lipid, that's directly put into your muscle. That then codes for the protein against which you develop an immune response. So there are different vehicles, and it has been found that by mixing vaccines, heterologous vaccination, you do get a somewhat higher neutralizing antibody response. Your antibodies after being vaccinated heterologously is somewhat higher. Now, exactly what that means is still really being studied. It does not necessarily mean that you're better protected. I must emphasize that. Obviously, antibodies are extremely important. They protect you, but there are also other components of the immune system, cellular immunity and so on, which also play a major role. So the choice between homologous and heterologous at this stage is to some extent 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. Many people will prefer heterologous because you get a high neutralizing antibody response. But on the other hand, homologous because you know it, you've experienced it in terms of any potential side effects from the vaccine. So you might prefer a homologous vaccine. So that's the background to it. The intervals and the mix and match. So let's see what it translates to. Those people who are on the Pfizer group, the Pfizer vaccinees, the primary interval, in other words, your first 2 doses, up to now, there's been a 6-week or 42-day interval between those 2 doses. From today onwards, that has been reduced to a minimum of 21 days or 3 weeks. Again, let me emphasize, you can come later. This is the minimal time when you can have your second dose. It's reduced from 42 days down to 21 days. The booster interval, after you've had your primary 2 doses, you're coming now back for your 3rd dose. It used to be 180 days or 6 months. And as I've shown you before, a lot of people just didn't come back then. So we thought, well, okay, let's reduce it to 90 days or 3 months, which is also going to give you a very good boosting. There may well be more people coming back for that boosting. Then in terms of the mix and match, the heterologous booster, up to now you've had Pfizer, and Pfizer, you come back for your booster as a Pfizer. Before 180 days, now from 90 days onwards. So you can stick with that if you want to, Pfizer, or you've also been offered a choice. And after you've had your 2 Pfizers, you can come back at 90 days and get a Johnson & Johnson booster. Then the Johnson & Johnson folk, so these are the healthcare workers, the teachers, and so on, who've had their 2 doses of Johnson & Johnson up to now, separated 2 months apart or 60 days apart. You can now, after you've had your first dose of Johnson & Johnson, which is your primary immunization, you can stick with Johnson & Johnson because you like Johnson & Johnson, or you can have your second dose as a Pfizer because you want to get a higher antibody response. That's your choice. So this is really what the changes are about. I'll leave this till next week. Actually, let me just go back here because I did get one question. If you've had your 2 Johnson & Johnson, can you have now a Pfizer after that? Unfortunately, at the moment, not. And the reason being is that Johnson & Johnson, the first dose is regarded as your primary immunization. That's equivalent to the 2 doses of Pfizer. And your second Johnson & Johnson is regarded as the booster. Now, this is how it stands at the moment. It may change, and we are actually trying to lobby for some change. I can't guarantee anything, either when or if. to have a third dose of a Pfizer following Johnson & Johnson. But at the moment, that's not in the cards. So if you've had your 2 doses of Johnson & Johnson, at the moment, that's it. All right, I'll stop there. So that's the one question which came in. I've covered that. Then there's another very interesting question that came, and I'm actually going to deal with it in greater detail next week under the rubric, why vaccinate? Because the question says, well, if you look at what's happened in many Northern Hemisphere countries, developed countries, look at Israel, for example, and many other countries, United Kingdom and so on. Now, they've had much higher vaccination coverages than we've had, and yet they've had a very much higher level of epidemic activity. Why is that? One can unfortunately jump to an erroneous conclusion, and next week I'll show you why it is erroneous, that are the vaccines working? Let me just at this stage emphasize, because it's important, the main reason for vaccination and the vaccines is to prevent severe disease. And yeah, they've worked extremely well. And I'll show you next week the actual statistics. But just to as a start, just to answer the question, there are 2 reasons why we get this kind of paradoxical situation. South Africa with a low vaccination rate, and yet had a much milder 4th wave. Industrial countries to the north having higher vaccination rate, and yet having more cases. First of all, it's really a numbers game. Even if you have 80% in Israel or in the United Kingdom or France and Germany coverage, because they've had a large population, that remnant of population is still pretty good, which are unvaccinated. And therefore, Omicron, which is a highly infectious, the most infectious of all the variants, has seeded very, very well in that unvaccinated population. And therefore, their hospitals have been overloaded with high cases and severe cases because they're unvaccinated. And secondly, what has been shown, it's a second point before I get to that, is that Omicron, one of the features of Omicron, I think I've dealt with it a few times before, is that it does have an ability to evade the immune response. However, once it evades the immune response, either from the vaccine or from past infection, it causes a mild disease, a very much milder disease. So again, the vaccine is critical in that category, keeping you as a mild disease. And the third main kind of reason is that if you look at the statistics, and I'll show you next week, of the people that have been hospitalized, both here as well as overseas, many countries, the great majority of the severe cases, the hospitalized cases, the great majority of those, over 80%, have been unvaccinated individuals. And those that have been vaccinated, unfortunately, do land in hospital. The majority of those, unfortunately, have underlying illnesses, various comorbidities. And even then, the vaccine has been quite effective in reducing the numbers. But obviously, a person that has severe comorbidities has to be extremely careful despite being vaccinated. So I'm going to leave it there. And I'll again wish you all keep safe, keep well. And thank you very much for listening and watching. Thank you.